Imagine holding a piece of parchment in your hands, a simple, fragile sheet that could decide the fate of nations. In the ancient world, maps weren't just guides for travelers or tools for merchants. They were instruments of power capable of starting wars, erasing cultures, and rewriting history with a single stroke of ink. Think about that for a moment. A line drawn in the dust or etched onto clay could become the spark that set entire empires ablaze. This is the hidden story of borders in antiquity, a tale where geography wasn't just about land, but about ambition, pride, and the raw desire to claim what others held dear. From the banks of the Nile to the rugged highlands of Persia, ancient rulers understood that a map was more than a representation of territory. It was a declaration. To draw a border was to say, "This is mine," and to challenge anyone who dared to disagree. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Romans, they all wielded maps like swords, using them to carve their dominance into the earth and into history. But these lines were never just lines. They were provocations, invitations to conflict, and sometimes the very reasons civilizations rose and fell. The Treaty of Kadesh, the Roman limes, the Silk Road's contested routes, each of these began with a map and ended in bloodshed. What's even more astonishing is how these ancient disputes still echo in our world today. The borders we argue over, the lands we fight for, many of them were first sketched out centuries ago by hands that understood the power of a well-placed line. So as we journey together through this forgotten history, ask yourself, how much has really changed? When we look at a modern map, are we seeing geography? Or are we seeing the ghostly outlines of ancient rivalries, still shaping our lives in ways we barely noticed? This is the story of how cartography became a battlefield and how the maps of the past continue to dictate the wars of the present. Buckle up, we're about to uncover the secrets hidden in the lines. In the hands of an ancient ruler, a map was never just a piece of parchment or clay, it was a weapon. Picture this, a Babylonian king unrolling a carefully inscribed tablet, his finger tracing the edges of his kingdom, deliberately stretching the boundaries beyond reality. To his subjects, it was proof of his divine right to rule. To his enemies, it was a silent threat. This wasn't just cartography, it was psychological warfare. From the earliest civilizations, maps served a dual purpose, guiding the traveler and manipulating the observer. Take the Egyptians, for example. Their maps of the Nile Delta weren't merely practical tools for agriculture or trade. They were declarations of control, emphasizing the pharaoh's dominion over the life-giving river. By exaggerating the fertility of their lands or the reach of their borders, they sent a clear message to neighboring powers: challenge us at your peril. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, city-states like Ur and Babylon produced maps that placed themselves at the center of the world, surrounded by lesser territories depicted as chaotic or barren. These weren't honest depictions of geography, they were carefully crafted narratives designed to legitimize rule and justify expansion. But the stakes were even higher when borders were disputed. A single line drawn across a map could escalate tensions from posturing to outright war. Imagine two rival kings, each holding their own version of the same territory, each convinced of their rightful claim. The act of inking that boundary wasn't just administrative, it was provocative, a dare to the other side to cross it. This wasn't unique to one civilization. From the Hittites to the Assyrians, leaders understood that a map could be as destabilizing as an army at the gates. What's fascinating is how these ancient strategies still resonate today. Modern leaders might use satellites instead of papyrus, but the underlying principle remains: control the map and you control the story. The ancients knew that borders weren't just about land, they were about perception, pride, and power. And as we'll see in the conflicts that followed, those lines on a map could ignite battles that lasted for generations. The scorching sands of Cadish bore witness to one of history's most pivotal border wars, a conflict that proved just how explosive a simple map could be. In the 13th century before the Common Era, two superpowers, Egypt under Ramses II and the Hittite Empire under Muwatalli II, found themselves locked in a deadly stalemate over this strategic Syrian city. Both kingdoms had drawn maps placing Kadesh firmly within their territory, and neither was willing to back down. What made this clash extraordinary wasn't just the scale of the battle, with thousands of chariots colliding in the dust, but what came after. For the first time in recorded history, a war ended not with total victory, but with a negotiated peace based on competing cartographic claims. The Treaty of Kadesh, etched onto gleaming silver tablets, didn't just divide land, it revealed how maps could serve as both weapons and peacemakers. The agreement meticulously described borders using landmarks like rivers and mountains, turning abstract lines into tangible reality. Remarkably, both sides walked away claiming victory, their respective maps still showing Kadesh under their control. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was an early lesson in the power of perception. What's often overlooked is how deeply symbolism played into this conflict. The Egyptians depicted Kadesh on temple walls as a gift from the gods, while Hittite maps framed it as the rightful spoils of their ancestors. These weren't neutral documents, they were crafted narratives designed to justify bloodshed. Even the treaty itself had two versions, each subtly altered to flatter its respective king. The Hittites emphasized their military prowess, while Ramses insisted his divine favor had secured the land. In the end, the real winner wasn't Egypt or Hatti. It was the idea that a map could shape reality as much as reflect it. The legacy of Kadesh rippled far beyond the battlefield. Future empires took note. If you could control how borders were drawn, you could control the story of who owned what. Assyrian kings would later mimic this tactic, using maps to erase defeated enemies from history. The Romans would adopt similar strategies, carving their dominion into stone for all to see. But it all started here in the dust of Syria, where two kings learned that ink could be as decisive as iron. The next time you glance at a modern map, remember those lines might look fixed, but they're really just the latest moves in a game that began over 3,000 years ago. The Persian Empire didn't just conquer territory, it conquered the imagination. Under the Achaemenid dynasty, maps became masterpieces of propaganda, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River with bold, unbroken lines that screamed inevitability. When Cyrus the Great or Darius I unrolled their imperial charts, they weren't just showing land, they were selling a vision, an empire so vast, so divinely ordained that resistance seemed futile. This wasn't just cartography, it was psychological warfare on parchment. By depicting their borders as limitless, the Persians turned geography into a weapon of intimidation, convincing rival kingdoms that submission was safer than defiance. But there was a fatal flaw in this strategy. The very maps meant to awe enemies could also guide them. Enter Alexander the Great, a young conqueror who saw Persian arrogance etched into those same sprawling charts. When he captured royal treasuries, he didn't just seize gold, he seized maps, detailed records of roads, rivers, and vulnerable frontier cities. Suddenly, the empire's grandeur became its blueprint for invasion. Alexander's army marched with Persian cartographers at their side, using the empire's own records to pinpoint weaknesses. The psychological trick had backfired spectacularly. Borders meant to intimidate now served as an instruction manual for dismantling the empire. What makes this reversal so fascinating is how it reveals the double-edged nature of ancient cartography. The Persians understood that maps could shape reality, but they underestimated how easily that reality could be weaponized against them. Their meticulously drawn borders, once symbols of invincibility, became mile markers for Alexander's relentless advance. Even the famed royal road, depicted on Persian maps as the empire's lifeline, turned into a highway for Macedonian troops. Yet the legacy of Persian mapmaking outlasted their empire. The Achaemenid tradition of grandiose borders influenced every empire that followed, from Rome to Byzantium. Leaders learned a hard lesson from Persia's downfall. A map might declare your dominance, but it could also betray your vulnerabilities. The next time you see a modern nation flaunt its territorial claims, remember, it's an ancient game, one where the lines on paper are never as solid as they appear. The Roman Empire didn't just build walls, it built statements. Stretching thousands of miles across Europe, the limes were more than mere fortifications. They were a physical manifestation of Rome's ambition, etched into the landscape like a challenge to the world. These borders, marked by towering palisades, deep ditches, and watchtowers piercing the horizon, weren't just meant to keep barbarians out. They were designed to remind everyone, from legionaries to Germanic chieftains, that Rome's power had limits, and those limits were non-negotiable. Yet in their grandeur lay a fatal irony. The very walls meant to deter invaders became symbols of something worth tearing down. Maps of the limes circulated throughout the empire, showcasing these boundaries as unshakable bulwarks. Roman officials proudly displayed them in forums and provincial capitals, reinforcing the idea that civilization ended where the empire's lines began. Beyond those lines, only chaos, or so the maps implied. But to the Germanic tribes, these cartographic declarations were an affront. The limes didn't just separate territory, they drew a moral divide, labeling those outside as lesser, as threats to be contained. The message was clear: Rome's geography was the only geography that mattered. What the Romans underestimated was how provocative this cartographic arrogance could be. The Germanic tribes weren't just scattered bands of raiders, they were complex societies with their own notions of territory and honor. When they looked at Roman maps, they didn't see an impenetrable border, they saw a dare. The limes became a magnet for defiance, a line in the sand that begged to be crossed. Tribes like the Franks and Goths didn't just attack the walls, they targeted the very idea behind them, proving that a border drawn too boldly could become a rallying cry for those it excluded. The turning point came not with a single battle, but with a slow, relentless pressure. Germanic tribes, once dismissed as disorganized threats, began to coordinate. They learned Roman tactics, exploited weak points in the limes, and most devastatingly, used Rome's own roads to surge deep into imperial territory. By the time the Rhine and Danube frontiers crumbled in the 3rd and 4th centuries, it was clear the maps had lied. The limes, those proud symbols of invincibility, had become monuments to overreach. Rome's fall wasn't just a military collapse, it was a cartographic one. The empire had bet everything on the idea that borders could be fixed, that lines on a map or stone in the ground could hold back the tides of change. But the Germanic tribes taught a harsh lesson. No wall is high enough to withstand the weight of resentment, and no empire can last when its geography becomes a grievance. Today, as modern nations debate fences and frontiers, the ghosts of the limes whisper a warning: borders don't just defend. They define, they provoke, and sometimes they fall. Silk wasn't the only thing traded along the ancient Silk Road. Blood flowed just as freely as luxury goods. This sprawling network of trade routes, stretching from China to the Mediterranean, wasn't just a highway for spices and silks. It was a battleground where empires fought not with swords, but with maps. Whoever controlled the depiction of these routes held the keys to unimaginable wealth, and kingdoms like Parthia and Han China understood this all too well. Their cartographers didn't just draw lines, they drew power. A single misrepresented mountain pass or omitted oasis could divert entire caravans into rival territory, starving enemies of gold and influence. Take the fierce rivalry between Parthia and Han China. Both empires produced maps that deliberately distorted the Silk Road's geography, each trying to funnel trade through their own territories. The Parthians, masters of the middle stretches, depicted the eastern routes as perilous wastelands, while Han maps exaggerated the dangers of the western legions. These weren't honest mistakes, they were calculated acts of economic warfare. By the time a merchant reached the contested city of Merv, they'd have been fed so many conflicting versions of the route that choosing a path felt like navigating a maze of lies. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Controlling the Silk Road meant controlling the flow of not just goods, but ideas, technology, religion, even languages spread along these routes. When the Han Dynasty sent envoys westward with carefully curated maps, they weren't just exploring, they were planting flags in the minds of traders. Meanwhile, the Parthians guarded their own charts like state secrets, knowing that if Rome ever grasped the full geography of the East, their monopoly would crumble. This was cartography as espionage, where ink could shift the balance of empires. What's often forgotten is how these map wars spilled into real bloodshed. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era wasn't just a military disaster for Rome, it was a collision of competing cartographies. The Parthians lured Crassus's legions into the desert using knowledge of terrain, so precise it might as well have been stolen from Roman maps. Later, when Chinese General Ban Kao pushed westward, his campaigns were guided by maps that erased entire Parthian strongholds, rendering them invisible to history. The Silk Road teaches us something profound about borders. They aren't just lines on land, but lines in the mind. An economic border, like those drawn on Silk Road maps, could be as divisive as any wall. Modern trade wars, sanctions, and tariffs are just the latest version of this ancient game, where controlling the map means controlling the money. The next time you see a shipping route or a trade agreement, remember, the ghosts of Parthian and Han cartographers are still whispering, still plotting, still fighting over who gets to draw the lines. To the ancient Greeks, the world didn't just end, it was forbidden beyond a certain point. The Pillars of Hercules, those towering cliffs flanking the Strait of Gibraltar, weren't merely a navigational landmark, they were a divine boundary, etched into maps as the literal edge of creation. Cross them and you risked the wrath of the gods. This wasn't just geography, it was theology in cartographic form. The Greeks didn't draw borders based on terrain or treaties alone. They mapped the cosmos itself, blending myth with territory in ways that shaped real-world politics. When Alexander the Great marched east, his ambition wasn't just to conquer lands but to reach the mythical river Ocean, a celestial boundary encircling the earth according to legend. His campaigns were as much about fulfilling prophecies as expanding empires. Half a world away, Chinese emperors wielded a different but equally potent myth, the mandate of heaven. Their maps didn't just show territory, they illustrated cosmic order. The Middle Kingdom wasn't a political term, it was a theological one, positioning China at the center of creation, surrounded by concentric rings of diminishing civilization. Barbarians weren't just outsiders, they were geographically ordained to be lesser, existing in the chaotic peripheries where the heavens' favor faded. This wasn't harmless folklore. When the Han Dynasty clashed with the Xiongnu Nomads, their maps justified conquest by framing it as a sacred duty to bring order to lands the gods had marked as unruly. The collision of these mythologies could be explosive. Take the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in Central Asia, where Greek settlers encountered Buddhist cosmology. Greek maps showed the world as a series of concentric circles around Delphi, while Buddhist mandalas depicted Mount Meru as the axis of the universe. When these visions clashed, it wasn't just a disagreement over land, it was a battle over reality itself. Temples were built on contested borders, not just to mark territory but to assert whose gods truly shaped the earth. Even the Romans, pragmatic as they were, couldn't resist mythic borders. The Tiber River wasn't just a waterway, it was the realm of Father Tiber, a deity whose blessing determined where Rome's influence should flow. When they expanded north, they didn't just conquer tribes, they absorbed local myths into their maps, turning Celtic sacred groves into Roman religious districts. This wasn't conquest, it was cartographic conversion. What's striking is how these ancient debates echo today. Modern conflicts over sacred sites, from Jerusalem to Iodea, still hinge on maps infused with divine meaning. The difference today, we call it geopolitics. Back then, they knew the truth. Every border was a prayer, every map a scripture, and when gods drew the lines, mortals bled for them. The Babylonian Immego Mundi wasn't just a map, it was a revolution carved into clay, unearthed from the ruins of a scribe's house in 19th century Iraq. This astonishing artifact, dating back to the 6th century before the Common Era, shows the world as Babylon saw it, a perfect circle with the Euphrates River slicing through the center, and Babylon itself enthroned at the heart of everything. Surrounding lands, mere distorted shapes huddled at the edges, labeled vaguely as distant regions or chaos lands. This wasn't geography, it was a manifesto. By placing their city at the cosmic bullseye, the Babylonians weren't just describing power, they were inventing it through cartography. What made this map so explosive wasn't its inaccuracies, it was its arrogance. To neighboring kingdoms like Elam and Assyria, the Immego Mundi wasn't a neutral document but a slap in the face. Imagine being an Elamite trader unrolling this clay tablet and seeing your homeland reduced to a squiggle at the fringe, while Babylon loomed large as the axis of creation. This was more than cultural pride, it was a theological claim. The map echoed Babylonian creation myths, where the god Marduk formed order from chaos by defeating primordial monsters. By extension, lands outside Babylon's central circle were implicitly chaotic, even unfinished, a notion that justified conquest as a divine duty. The political fallout was immediate. Assyrian envoys reportedly mocked the map as clay-born folly, while Elamite priests produced counter-maps placing their temples at the world's center. This wasn't just a clash of borders, it was a war of cosmic visions. When Babylon's King Nebuchadnezzar II invaded Judah in 597 before the Common Era, his soldiers carried copies of the Immego Mundi as psychological weapons. To see Jerusalem marked as a peripheral dot was to understand its insignificance in Babylon's grand design, yet the map's true genius lay in its adaptability. As Babylon's empire expanded, scribes updated the Immego Mundi by simply stretching the central circle, absorbing new territories into the ordered world. Conquered cities like Ur and Larsa suddenly appeared closer to the center, their status elevated by ink and stylus. This flexible cosmology gave Babylon's wars a veneer of inevitability. If the map said you belonged to the empire, resistance wasn't just treason, it was unnatural. The irony, this masterpiece of propaganda sowed the seeds of Babylon's downfall. Persian conquerors like Cyrus the Great grasped the map's power and turned it against its creators. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, he didn't destroy the Immego Mundi, he reinterpreted it, declaring himself the new center of the world. The clay survived, but its message was overwritten, proving that even the most audacious maps could be redrawn by stronger hands. Today, as nations still jockey to place themselves at the center of world maps, whether through Mercator projections or geopolitical influence, the ghost of Babylon whispers a timeless truth. Every map is a battleground, and every line is a claim waiting to be challenged. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where mist curled around ancient laurel trees, the Oracle of Delphi didn't just predict the future, she drew borders with divine authority. For the Greeks, territorial disputes weren't settled by surveys or treaties alone. They were resolved by the whispered words of a priestess inhaling sacred vapors. A single cryptic prophecy could send armies marching or halt them in their tracks, turning geography into a matter of celestial decree. When Sparta and Athens clashed over the fertile plains of Messenia, both sides rushed emissaries to Delphi, not with maps but with gifts for Apollo, hoping the god would tilt the scales of possession in their favor. The oracle's pronouncements weren't just advice, they were cartography written in the language of the gods. This fusion of faith and frontier had chilling consequences. Take the infamous wooden walls prophecy delivered to Athens before the Persian invasion. The oracle's ambiguous words, interpreted by some as a call to retreat behind city fortifications, and by others as a command to build naval defenses, didn't just shape military strategy. They redrew the psychological map of Athenian influence, convincing leaders to abandon the countryside and stake their survival on the sea. Overnight, farmland became expendable, and the Aegean became Athens' new border. Delphi's influence stretched far beyond Greece, too. When colonists set sail for Sicily or Cyrene, they carried not just compasses but oracular directives, planting cities precisely where the gods had approved through the priestess's trance. But the oracle's power wasn't just spiritual, it was deeply political. Priests at Delphi maintained intricate ties with powerful city-states, and prophecies often echoed the ambitions of their patrons. A well-timed prediction could legitimize land grabs or smear rivals as impious transgressors. When Thebes wanted to weaken its neighbor Orchomenos, Delphi suddenly declared the latter's lands cursed by ancient offenses, giving Thebes holy permission to annex them. The maps that resulted from these divine verdicts were unlike any others. They showed borders not as lines in the dirt, but as lines in the cosmos sanctioned by deities. The darkest twist, some oracular borders were designed to fail. Before the Battle of Thermopylae, Delphi allegedly told the Spartans that either their king must die or their city would fall. The prophecy forced Leonidas into a suicidal stand, transforming a mountain pass into a sacred boundary where sacrifice replaced strategy. In this light, Delphi's prophecies weren't just guiding borders. They were setting traps, using divine inevitability to justify human suffering. Yet for all its manipulation, the oracle's greatest legacy was the illusion of impartiality. When two warring cities received conflicting prophecies, neither could accuse the other of forgery, only of misinterpretation. This divine ambiguity kept the system alive for centuries, allowing Delphi to act as the ancient world's ultimate mapmaker, her words redrawing territories long before the blood dried on the battlefield. Today, as modern leaders still invoke higher powers to justify borders, from manifest destiny to divine right, the shadow of Delphi lingers, a reminder that the lines between earth and heaven, like those between nations, are often drawn by those who claim to speak for the gods. Long before stone met mortar in the construction of China's Great Wall, another battle was raging, one fought not with bricks but with brushes and ink. The Han Dynasty's cartographers didn't just map their realm, They weaponized perception, carefully depicting the vast northern steppes as a lawless void where the Xiongnu nomads lurked like beasts beyond the edges of civilization. These weren't neutral landscapes, they were moral diagrams, dividing the world into us and them, with strokes as deliberate as sword cuts. On hand maps, the Xiongnu territories appeared distorted, compressed into narrow bands of hostile terrain, while the Middle Kingdom sprawled in meticulous detail, its cities and farms rendered with reverence. The message was unmistakable. Beyond these lines lay not people but predators. This cartographic dehumanization had a chilling purpose. By erasing the complexity of Xiongnu culture, their sophisticated horseback warfare, their intricate clan alliances, the Han turned them into faceless threats, making perpetual war seem inevitable. Court officials would unfurl these maps before the emperor, pointing to the blank spaces labeled barbarian wastelands as proof that expansion wasn't just strategic but sacred. The historian Sima Qian recorded how these depictions fueled policies. Xiongnu envoys were barred from seeing accurate maps of Han territory, while Chinese generals carried distorted charts that exaggerated the desolation of the steppes. Geography became propaganda, and borders became moral absolutes. Yet the Xiongnu weren't passive victims of this paper war. They retaliated with their own form of cartographic resistance. Lacking written maps, they used carved bone tablets and oral poetry to describe the land, weaving stories that framed the Great Wall not as a boundary, but as a trespass, a scar cutting through ancestral grazing grounds. When they raided Han settlements, they targeted map repositories, burning scrolls in acts of symbolic defiance. To destroy a map was to deny the enemy's version of reality. The Great Wall itself emerged as the ultimate expression of this conflict. Early sections followed precisely the lines Han maps had marked as civilization's edge, physically cementing the idea that the Xiongnu belonged outside the human order. But the wall's very existence betrayed a paradox. The harder the Han tried to fix their borders in stone, the more the Xiongnu proved those borders were illusions. Nomadic cavalry easily outflanked static defenses, and seasonal migrations ignored walled divisions. The wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a confession of fear, a monument to the limits of imperial cartography. Centuries later, archaeologists would find Han maps buried in frontier forts, their edges worn thin by anxious fingers tracing hypothetical attacks. These fragile papers held a truth their makers never admitted. Borders drawn in ink could no more stop people than lines in the sand. The Xiongnu, ultimately, weren't conquered by walls or maps, but by the Han's reluctant realization that some boundaries exist only in the mind. Today, as debates over immigration and exclusion flare worldwide, the ghost of those ancient cartographers whispers a warning. When we draw lines to divide humanity, we risk building walls around our own understanding. Claudius Ptolemy never set foot on a ship, never saw the edge of the known world, yet for over 1,000 years, his pen shaped how empires sailed into the unknown. His Geographia, written in the 2nd century, wasn't just a collection of maps, it was a revolution bound in parchment, distilling the entire Roman world into grids of latitude and longitude. For the first time, geography had rules, a mathematical precision that made earlier maps look like children's sketches. But buried in Ptolemy's brilliance lay a catastrophic miscalculation. He shrank the Earth by nearly a quarter, squeezing continents closer together like a folded accordion. This wasn't just a harmless error, it was a miscalculation that would ignite centuries of colonial violence. Fast forward to the 15th century, when a Genos navigator named Christopher Columbus pored over a copy of Ptolemy's work. The numbers whispered a tantalizing lie. Asia was just a short voyage west. No wonder Columbus dismissed his terrified crew's mutterings when land failed to appear. Ptolemy's authority outweighed the evidence of their own eyes. When the Caribbean islands finally emerged from the horizon, Columbus died believing he'd reached the Indies, all because a Greek scholar 1,500 years earlier had drawn the world too small. The consequences rippled far beyond one man's delusion. Ptolemy's miscalculation became the cartographic foundation for the Treaty of Tordesillas, where Spain and Portugal split the globe along a line that existed only on paper, and only because Ptolemy's maps made the Earth seem ripe for division. But the real tragedy wasn't just the error, it was how Ptolemy's legacy hardened into dogma. For generations, dissenting voices were silenced. Arab geographers like al-Idrisi, who produced more accurate maps, were ignored by European powers clinging to Ptolemaic certainty. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, his pilots carried maps still referencing Ptolemy's phantom, mountains of the moon, a non-existent range believed to feed the Nile. These weren't just navigational aids, they were intellectual straitjackets binding explorers to ancient mistakes. The bloodshed that followed was as predictable as it was avoidable. Colonies were established based on flawed coordinates, pitting European powers against each other and against indigenous nations, in wars over lands that weren't where the maps said they should be. The brutal conquest of the Aztecs, the scramble for Africa, even the myth of El Dorado, all were fueled by maps that promised a world simpler and smaller than reality. Ptolemy couldn't have foreseen how his work would be weaponized, but that's the peril of cartographic authority. Once a line is drawn, empires will march to defend it, even if it leads them off the edge of the known world. Yet there's a haunting beauty in how Ptolemy's mistakes unraveled. As sailors ventured farther, they began scribbling corrections in the margins of his maps, adding coastlines he'd never imagined. Slowly, painfully, the Earth regained its true proportions not through the calculations of scholars, but through the lived experience of those who dared to question the map. The lesson echoes through history. No border is sacred, no line infallible, and sometimes the greatest discoveries begin by admitting that the world is far stranger and far larger than our ancestors ever dreamed. The scorching plains of Mesopotamia became the stage for one of history's longest and most exhausting border wars, a grinding conflict where ink proved as deadly as arrows. For over 7 centuries, the Byzantine and Sassanid empires clashed over this fertile crescent, each claiming divine right to lands that had seen civilizations rise and fall for millennia. But this wasn't just a fight over territory. It was a war of perception where maps became mirrors reflecting each empire's deepest convictions. Byzantine cartographers depicted their eastern frontier as a sacred bulwark against Persian tyranny, framing every fortress and river as part of Christendom's unbreakable shield. The Sassanids, in turn, unrolled silk maps showing those same lands as ancestral Zoroastrian soil, stolen by Roman treachery. Geography wasn't just contested, it was sanctified, turning border skirmishes into holy wars. What made this struggle so devastating was its sheer futility. The frontier shifted endlessly. Cities like Dara and Nisibis changed hands over a dozen times, their walls scarred by siege after siege. Yet despite the bloodshed, neither side could land a decisive blow. The reason? Their maps lied in perfect symmetry. Byzantine charts exaggerated the aridity of Persian-held lands, making conquest seem pointless, while Sassanid scribes downplayed Mesopotamia's fertility, framing their campaigns as righteous reclamation rather than greedy expansion. These weren't navigational tools, they were self-fulfilling prophecies, ensuring neither empire could imagine a world where the other belonged. The cost of this cartographic stalemate was catastrophic. By the early 7th century, both empires were hollowed out, their treasuries drained, their armies exhausted, their people yearning for an end to the endless tug of war. Then came the unthinkable, a new force emerging from the Arabian deserts, armed not with maps of old grievances but with a vision that ignored both empires' carefully drawn lines. The Islamic conquests didn't just cross borders, they erased them, sweeping through Mesopotamia like a sandstorm burying ancient footprints. In hindsight, the Byzantines and Sassanids hadn't been fighting for land, they'd been fighting for the right to keep fighting, prisoners of maps that told them victory was always just one more battle away. The lesson here is as stark as a desert sunrise. When borders become articles of faith, compromise becomes heresy. Modern conflicts in the Middle East still bear the scars of this ancient rivalry, where lines drawn in dust or ink can outlast the empires that drew them. The next time you see a map of contested lands, ask yourself, is this geography or is it mythology? And who stands to gain when we mistake one for the other? Viking longships didn't just cut through waves, they sliced through the very concept of borders. While other cultures drew lines to mark where their kingdoms ended, Norse navigators sketched coastlines to show where plunder began. Their legendary Mappa Mundi wasn't a map in the traditional sense. It was a hit list carved onto driftwood or etched into animal hide, charting not territory but vulnerability. Monasteries appeared as fat jewels along riverbanks, undefended towns stood circled like ripe fruit, and narrow estuaries were marked not for their beauty but for how far a dragon-prowed ship could sail inland before striking. This was cartography stripped of pretense, no divine mandates, no cosmic hierarchies, just cold, calculating opportunity. What made Viking maps so terrifyingly effective was their fluidity. Unlike the rigid borders of Rome or Persia, Norse charts embraced impermanence. A settlement might appear as a target one year and vanish the next, either razed to the ground or deemed not worth revisiting. The famous Norse map fragment found in Greenland doesn't show static borders but shifting currents, the Gulf Stream painted as a watery highway leading straight to the riches of Francia and Anglo-Saxon England. These weren't documents meant to last generations. They were working tools updated with each voyage, their edges frayed by salt-stained fingers tracing the next vulnerable point. The psychological impact of this approach reshaped Europe. When the Lindisfarne monastery fell in 793, it wasn't just an attack, it was a revelation. The Vikings hadn't come blindly. They'd studied tidal charts, memorized the layout of ecclesiastical treasures, and likely consulted maps passed between crews. As raids intensified, terrified monks began altering their own cartography, deliberately omitting wealthy abbeys from copied manuscripts or sketching false shoals near their shores. This sparked history's first known case of defensive map fraud, a desperate attempt to turn the invaders' greatest weapon against them. Yet the Vikings' true innovation wasn't their brutality, but their network thinking. Recent studies of sunstone navigation suggest they may have mapped not just coasts, but atmospheric conditions, recording how light polarized through crystals could reveal the sun's position even through storm clouds. Their maps likely included oral components too, rhymes encoding sailing times, alliterative lists of landmarks, even wind lore passed down in skaldic verses. This multidimensional approach allowed them to strike with eerie precision, hitting Paris in 845 not by chance, but by following a web of intelligence woven from 100 whispered reports and weather observations. The ultimate irony, these feared raiders became victims of their own cartographic success. As Viking settlements grew permanent in places like Normandy and Dublin, their descendants began drawing borders like the people they'd once terrorized. The very maps that enabled their conquests now chained them to static kingdoms, a fate their ancestors would have considered worse than drowning. Today, as modern militaries still grapple with asymmetrical warfare, the ghost of Viking mapping whispers a timeless truth. The most dangerous borders aren't the ones you can see, but the ones your enemies don't even recognize as lines. When the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma unrolled his sacred maps for Cortés, he wasn't just showing the Spanish conquistador a city, he was revealing an entire cosmology. At the center of these breathtaking documents stood Tenochtitlan, rendered as a perfect circle crisscrossed by canals, its grand temples rising like axes connecting earth to heaven. Radiating outward in precise geometric patterns were the tributary states, each drawn smaller and simpler the farther they lay from the capital. This wasn't cartography, it was celestial choreography, placing the Aztecs at the heart of creation and everyone else in diminishing orbits of importance. What Moctezuma didn't realize was that this visual hierarchy, meant to awe visitors, would become a blueprint for his empire's unraveling. The map's brilliance masked a fatal arrogance. Aztec scribes used vivid pigments to distinguish between core territories and vassal states. Tenochtitlan glowed in sacred blues and golds, while subject cities like Tlaxcala appeared in muted earth tones, their names written smaller, their landmarks simplified. To the Aztecs, this was divine order. To the Tlaxcalans, it was an insult etched in ink. Spanish chronicles record how Tlaxcalan ambassadors, forced to kneel before these maps during tribute negotiations, seethed at seeing their homeland reduced to a decorative fringe. The resentment wasn't just political, it was spiritual. By erasing the complexity of subject peoples' histories and sacred sites, the maps denied their very humanity, framing them as expendable satellites to the Aztec sun. Cortés, ever the opportunist, recognized this cartographic tension immediately. When Tlaxcalan leaders secretly brought him their own maps, crude by Aztec standards but rich with details of hidden mountain passes and lightly guarded storehouses, he grasped their true value. These weren't just military aids, they were manifestos. Where Aztec maps showed unity, Tlaxcalan charts revealed fractures, marking which tributary cities might rebel if given the chance. The conquistador's genius wasn't in his cannons or cavalry, but in realizing that empires often map their own weaknesses in the very documents meant to showcase strength. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 wasn't just a military defeat, it was a collapse of cartographic certainty. As Spanish forces and their indigenous allies flooded the city, they targeted the House of Maps, burning centuries of carefully rendered codices. But some survived, smuggled out by scribes who understood their power. Today, the surviving Mapa de Sigüenza shows a haunting revision. Tenochtitlan remains central, but now Spanish churches loom over its temples, and the radiating tributary lines are broken, their connections severed. In this one fragile document, we see the moment an empire's worldview shattered not from superior weapons, but from the fatal mistake of believing their own maps too completely. The Aztecs had drawn their dominance as inevitable, their subjects as obedient. The Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, the Huixtzinca, they all proved otherwise. Perhaps the cruelest twist, modern Mexico City, built atop Tenochtitlan's ruins, still follows that ancient radial design, its streets echoing the old Aztec maps. The empire fell, but its cartographic ghost lingers, a reminder that borders drawn in arrogance often outlived the hands that drew them. While other empires etched borders onto stone or parchment, the Inca wove theirs into intricate knots. The Quipu, a complex system of colored, knotted cords, was their answer to cartography, a tactile record of everything from grain stores to troop movements. Without a single fixed line drawn on any map, the Inca built the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, stretching across the Andes like a living tapestry. Their borders weren't marked by walls or fences, but by relationships, loyalty to the Sapa Inca, shared labor obligations, and the rhythmic movement of goods along roads that snaked through the mountains. This was an empire of motion, where control flowed like water through irrigation channels rather than being locked behind rigid lines. The genius of the Quipu lay in its adaptability. A trained Quipucamayak, not master, could update records in real time, adding or untying knots to reflect shifting alliances, harvest yields, or the movement of Mitta laborers. When new territories were absorbed, they weren't conquered so much as woven into the system, their tribute recorded in new strands, their sacred sites acknowledged as part of the empire's sacred geography. Unlike the Aztecs, who mapped their dominance in stark hierarchies, the Incas' not language allowed for nuance. A rebellious region might be represented by a tense, tightly wound knot, while a loyal ally's cord could hang loose and flowing. The Quipu wasn't just an administrative tool. It was a living, breathing representation of an empire that saw borders as fluid conversations rather than ultimatums. Yet this very flexibility became their undoing when the Spanish arrived with their obsession for fixed lines. Conquistadors demanded to see maps, something the Inca couldn't produce. To Pizarro and his men, a kingdom without borders was incomprehensible, even illegitimate. The Spanish tore through Quipus, dismissing them as primitive curiosities while they imposed their own rigid land grants and property lines. The Incas' strength, their ability to govern through relationships rather than coercion, became a fatal weakness against an enemy that only understood possession in terms of fences and titles. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of territory, but the unraveling of an entire worldview. The Quipu's knots had encoded not just data but philosophy, an understanding that land wasn't something to be owned but stewarded. Roads connected people rather than dividing them, and mountains were ancestors rather than obstacles. When the last Quipucamayaks were executed or forced to convert, centuries of knowledge dissolved like ropes cut from a bridge. Today, as scholars painstakingly decode surviving Quipus, they're uncovering a radical alternative to how societies can organize space. The Inca didn't just lack borders, they rejected the very premise. In an age where nations still fight over lines drawn by long-dead colonizers, their not language whispers a provocative question: what if the most powerful borders are the ones we never draw at all? To the knights marching toward Jerusalem under the banner of the cross, maps weren't just guides, they were holy relics infused with divine truth. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, one of the most stunning medieval maps still in existence, didn't bother with accurate coastlines or practical trade routes. Instead, it presented the world as a cosmic stage, with Jerusalem planted firmly at the center like an umbilical cord connecting heaven and earth. The Nile might curve unnaturally, the Alps might vanish entirely, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the spiritual hierarchy, the Garden of Eden floating at the top like a dangling jewel, the monstrous races lurking at the edges, and Christ himself presiding over the map from the heavens. This wasn't geography, it was theology in ink and vellum, and it shaped the fate of millions. When Crusaders clutched these maps as they stormed the Holy Land, they weren't just conquering cities, they were fulfilling prophecies etched into parchment. The brutal sack of Jerusalem in 1099 wasn't merely a military campaign, it was a cartographic inevitability. The maps had told them the city was the center of the world, so capturing it wasn't just victory, it was restoration, a way to snap the universe back into its rightful order. Never mind that the real Jerusalem was a bustling, multicultural hub where Christians, Jews, and Muslims had coexisted for centuries. On the Hereford map, it was a symbolic dot, stripped of its people, its complexity, its humanity. The tragedy of Crusader cartography wasn't just its inaccuracy, but its arrogance. Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi had already created stunningly precise maps of the region, showing winding roads, mountain passes, and thriving ports. But the European invaders dismissed these as pagan distortions, clinging instead to maps that framed their violence as sacred duty. When Richard the Lionheart negotiated with Saladin, his demands weren't based on terrain or strategy. They were lifted straight from the fantastical borders of the Mappa Mundi, with its rivers flowing from paradise and its continents arranged like petals around Jerusalem. The result, a war that dragged on for generations, fueled by maps that bore no resemblance to the land being fought over. Even more chilling was how these maps erased living history. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, venerated by Christians as the site of Christ's burial, was carefully marked on Crusader charts, but the Dome of the Rock, equally sacred to Muslims and Jews, might as well not have existed. By literally drawing non-Christian sites out of the picture, these maps didn't just justify conquest, they prefigured cultural annihilation. When Crusaders slaughtered Jerusalem's inhabitants, they weren't just killing enemies, they were purging heresy from a landscape their maps had already cleansed in ink. Yet the greatest irony lies in what happened when the Crusaders finally held Jerusalem. Their maps had promised a city at the center of creation, a place where heaven touched earth. The reality, a cramped, fractious town where rival Christian factions bickered over relics, where supply lines stretched thin across hostile terrain, and where the holy borders they dreamed of proved impossible to defend. The maps had led them to victory, but they offered no guidance for what came after. By the time Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, the Crusaders' grand cartographic vision had collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. Centuries later, the scars of this ideological mapping still linger. Modern conflicts over sacred sites from the Temple Mount to Bethlehem's shrines still hinge on competing visions of who belongs at the center of the story. The Hereford Mappa Mundi now sits behind glass in a quiet cathedral, its vibrant colors fading, but its lesson remains vivid. When faith draws the borders, the earth itself becomes a battleground, and the lines between devotion and delusion blur until only blood can tell them apart. The Mongol Empire stretched across continents with a speed and scale that left the ancient world breathless, not by drawing borders, but by erasing them. At the heart of this vast, pulsing network lay the Yam, their legendary postal system, a web of relay stations and galloping riders that could carry messages from the Danube to the Yellow River in weeks. But what truly set the Mongols apart were their maps, not static declarations of territory, but living documents of movement showing rivers to ford, mountain passes to exploit, and grazing lands to sustain their armies. These weren't maps of ownership, they were maps of opportunity, sketching the world as a series of routes rather than realms. A Mongol cartographer would sooner mark the location of a freshwater spring than the boundary of some petty kingdom, because water mattered more than walls. This borderless approach was their greatest strength. While European kings squabbled over inches of land, the Mongols flowed like mercury across Eurasia, their empire expanding or contracting with the seasons. When a Venetian merchant asked a Mongol commander where his people's borders lay, the reply was laughter. Borders are for farmers who fear the horizon. Their maps reflected this philosophy. Rolling steps were drawn in meticulous detail, while fixed cities appeared as mere waypoints. This fluidity let them adapt with terrifying speed. When spies reported weakness in Persia, Genghis Khan's generals didn't consult treaties or surveyors. They followed the maps of the Yam, riding hard along routes already scouted by traders and scouts. Yet the absence of borders was also their undoing. Without clear lines of control, the empire relied entirely on personal loyalty to the Great Khan. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, the Yam's maps still showed a unified realm, but the reality had shattered into rival khanates. The routes remained, but now carried declarations of war instead of imperial decrees. The Mongols had mastered the art of conquest but forgotten the politics of permanence. Their maps, so brilliant at guiding armies, offered no answers when those armies turned on each other. The legacy of Mongol cartography survives in unexpected ways. Modern logistics networks, from Amazon's delivery routes to global shipping lanes, echo the Yam's focus on movement over territory. Even the internet, with its borderless flow of information, owes a quiet debt to those 13th century riders who proved that sometimes the most powerful lines aren't the ones you draw but the ones you ride. In the labyrinthine canals of Venice, where secrets flowed as freely as the tides, the most valuable treasures weren't gold or jewels, they were lines on parchment. The Venetian Portolan charts, painstakingly crafted by master cartographers, didn't just depict the Mediterranean, they controlled it. These weren't mere navigational aids but instruments of economic warfare, so closely guarded that revealing one to a foreign power could land you in the Doge's dungeons or at the bottom of the Adriatic. What made these maps so explosive wasn't their artistry, though they were breathtaking, but their precision. Hidden shoals, secret harbors, and seasonal currents known only to Venetian captains were recorded with an accuracy that turned trade into a monopoly. To possess a Venetian portolan was to hold the keys to the richest sea routes on Earth. The Senate of Venice enforced this cartographic secrecy with ruthless efficiency. Mapmakers worked in isolated workshops under armed guard, their windows shuttered to prevent prying eyes. Finished charts were stored in the Archivio di Stato, accessible only to senior officials and trusted navigators. Even the paper itself was a state secret imported from Lucca under strict embargo, treated with chemicals to resist salt and mildew. The penalties for smuggling a chart were draconian. In 1422, a Genoese spy was publicly flayed in Piazza San Marco for attempting to bribe a Venetian cartographer. His skin, it was said, was stretched over a frame as a warning, a grisly reminder that in Venice, maps were worth more than lives. Yet the true genius of Venetian cartography lay in its deception. Some portolans included deliberate errors, phantom islands, mislabeled capes, distorted coastlines known only to Venetian sailors. A rival ship following one of these doctored maps might find itself wrecked on reefs that didn't exist or circling endlessly in search of a harbor that had been moved miles from its true location. The most infamous example was the Devil's Whirlpool, an entirely fictional maelstrom marked near Crete that terrified Ottoman captains into avoiding lucrative trade lanes. Venice didn't just defend its borders with walls, it weaponized imagination, turning the sea itself into a labyrinth only its own pilots could navigate. The breaking of this cartographic monopoly came not through war but through betrayal. In 1485, a disgruntled mapmaker named Alvise Cadamosto fled to Portugal, carrying a stolen portolan rolled inside a hollowed-out oar. The document revolutionized Iberian navigation, enabling Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa and shattering Venice's stranglehold on Eastern trade. The Republic responded with fury. Cadamosto's family was exiled, his name chiseled off every public monument, but the damage was done. The secret was out, and with it, Venice's dominance began to ebb like the tides it once commanded. What lingers from this saga isn't just the ruthlessness of Venetian statecraft, but the uncomfortable truth it reveals about power and knowledge. In an age where Google Maps can chart the planet in seconds, we forget how recently maps were matters of life and death. Modern trade wars over patents or shipping lanes are just the latest echo of Venice's parchment battles. The next time you glance at a GPS, remember, every line on that screen is a descendant of those inked secrets, and the fight to control them never really ended. It just moved from the Doge's palace to the digital realm. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, where ceiba trees pierced the sky like living bridges between worlds, the Maya crafted maps unlike any other, not to mark territory, but to reveal the sacred bones of the universe. Their codices, painted in vivid blues from rare Maya blue pigment and inscribed with intricate glyphs, didn't just depict cities and trade routes, they charted the cosmic order itself. A single page might show Tikal not as a cluster of pyramids, but as a nexus where the earthly realm intersected with Xibalba, the underworld, its temples aligned with constellations that dictated the rhythms of life and death. To hold a Maya codex was to hold a key to existence, where geography and divinity were inseparable. When Spanish conquistadors like Diego de Landa tossed these sacred books into bonfires in the 1600s, they weren't merely destroying artifacts, they were attacking a way of seeing. The Maya didn't just live on the land, they conversed with it. Rivers weren't just waterways but the veins of the earth serpent. Caves weren't hollows but mouths of the underworld. And roads weren't mere paths but sacred processions mirroring the journey of the sun god. By burning the codices, the Spanish sought to sever this connection, to reduce the landscape to something measurable, exploitable, and above all, controllable. But in their zeal, they overlooked one thing: you can burn parchment, but you can't burn memory. The resistance that followed wasn't just political, it was cartographic. Maya scribes, forbidden from recreating their codices, began hiding sacred geography in plain sight. They wove cosmic patterns into textiles, carved celestial alignments into the facades of colonial churches, and even encoded maps into the choreography of traditional dances. The Popol Vuh, the Maya creation epic, survived orally, its descriptions of the world tree and the four directional corners serving as a mental map for generations denied their physical records. In remote villages, elders continued to teach children the old ways, whispering the true names of mountains and springs that Spanish maps had renamed or erased. The most defiant act of all, the survival of the Madrid Codex, one of the few pre-Columbian Maya books to escape the flames. Hidden for centuries, its pages reveal a stunning truth: the Maya never stopped mapping. Amidst astrological tables and ritual calendars, careful readers can trace the outlines of sacred caves, the routes of pilgrimage trails, even the locations of hidden water sources, knowledge that allowed Maya communities to endure when colonial maps declared their lands pacified. Today, as archaeologists piece together fragments of surviving codices, they're uncovering a radical philosophy that borders aren't just lines on the ground, but layers of meaning. Modern Maya activists in Guatemala and Mexico now wield these rediscovered maps in land disputes, proving their ancestors' ties to contested territories not with colonial deeds, but with the very cosmology the Spanish tried to destroy. The lesson is as potent as it is painful. Some borders are drawn in ink, others in blood, but the ones that endure are etched into the soul. The conquistadors thought they could erase a world by burning its maps. The Maya proved them wrong by remembering. High in the rugged highlands of Ethiopia, where the air thins and ancient monasteries cling to cliffs like eagles' nests, a single book wielded more power than any army. The Kebra Nagast, Glory of Kings, wasn't just a religious text. It was a cartographic declaration of independence written in parchment and prophecy. Unlike European maps cluttered with coastlines and compass roses, this 14th century masterpiece drew borders in divine ink, tracing Ethiopia's sovereignty back to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Its pages didn't just tell a story, they mapped a sacred genealogy, with Jerusalem and Axum connected by threads of holy bloodline. When Portuguese missionaries arrived in the 16th century, armed with maps claiming Africa for Christendom, Ethiopian emperors met them not with swords, but with this unshakable counter-narrative, their land was already chosen, its borders ordained by God himself. The brilliance of the Kebra Nagast lay in its fusion of scripture and sovereignty. It didn't merely say Ethiopia was special, it proved it through meticulous cartographic theology. The book described how the Ark of the Covenant had been spirited away from Jerusalem to Axum, making Ethiopia the new Zion. Rivers like the Blue Nile weren't just waterways but sacred boundaries, their courses mirroring the Jordan in biblical lore. Even the Simeon Mountains were reframed as God's ramparts, their peaks echoing the walls of Jerusalem. This wasn't poetry, it was geopolitical strategy. When the Ottoman Empire encroached from the north, Emperor Gelawdewos didn't just rally troops, he brandished the Kebra Nagast, declaring his people were defending not just soil but covenant. Europe's colonizers found this spiritual cartography utterly baffling. Portuguese attempts to reconvert Ethiopians to their version of Christianity floundered against a people who could point to their own maps of salvation. A Jesuit missionary's diary from 1622 records his frustration. They show us their holy book and say we are the ones who have lost the true way. The Kebra Nagast became a shield against cultural erasure, its narrative so potent that even when Ethiopia temporarily lost coastal territories to Italy in the 19th century, its heartland remained unconquered in the imagination of its people. Modern scholars have uncovered something startling in the Kebra Nagast's endurance. It anticipated modern concepts of cultural sovereignty by 6 centuries. While European powers divided Africa with rulers at the Berlin Conference of 1884, Ethiopia's borders had already been drawn in the ink of collective memory. The book's description of lands where the shadow of the Ark falls created an elastic but unbreakable sense of territory, one that couldn't be altered by foreign treaties or colonial whims. The ultimate testament to its power, Italy's brief occupation from 1936 to 1941. Though Mussolini's forces seized Addis Ababa, they could never claim the Kebra Nagast's Ethiopia. Resistance fighters rallied around copies of the text, and Emperor Haile Selassie's famous League of Nations speech invoked its vision of divine justice. When liberation came, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a vindication of a map drawn in faith. Today, as the original Kebra Nagast rests in Axum's Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by monks who have memorized every word, it whispers a timeless lesson. The strongest borders aren't always the ones you can see, but the ones you believe. For over 250 years, Japan existed in a self-imposed cocoon of isolation, and its maps were the silken threads that held this fragile world together. The Kunizu, exquisite hand-painted surveys of each feudal domain, weren't just administrative tools, they were instruments of control, turning the jagged coastline of the archipelago into an impenetrable mental fortress. Commissioned by the Tokugawa shogunate starting in the 17th century, these maps served a singular purpose: to reinforce the rigid hierarchy of a society that had slammed its doors shut to the outside world. Every mountain pass, every rice paddy, every castle town was meticulously recorded, not to facilitate travel, but to restrict it. The Kunizu didn't guide journeys, they policed them, their delicate brushstrokes inking the boundaries between feudal lords' lands as clearly as prison walls. What made these maps so effective was their deliberate inaccuracy. Strategic roads were omitted, coastlines were subtly distorted, and entire regions were depicted as impassable wilderness, even if merchants knew otherwise. The shogunate's cartographers weren't concerned with geographic truth, they were crafting a narrative of containment. A peasant consulting a Kunizu would see not a nation, but a patchwork of disconnected domains, each self-sufficient, each obedient to Edo. This was cartography as social engineering, teaching generations of Japanese that their world ended at their daimyo's border. Even the rare European maps that slipped through the Dutch trading post at Dejima were confiscated and locked away, their dangerous knowledge of a connected world deemed too subversive for Japanese eyes. Then came the Black Ships, when Commodore Matthew Perry's steam-powered squadron appeared off Yoroga in 1853. Their cannons weren't the only weapons that shattered Japan's isolation, their maps did too. American naval cartographers had charted the very waters Japanese maps labeled forbidden, their precise depth soundings and coastal surveys revealing the Kunizu's fabrications. The shogun's officials, presented with Western maps showing the exact distance between Edo and San Francisco, realized with horror that their closed world was a fiction. The Kunizu's carefully drawn borders, meant to keep Japan pure, had instead left it blind. The collapse was swift and total. As the Tokugawa regime crumbled, the new Meiji government scrapped the feudal maps entirely, replacing them with Western-style surveys that depicted Japan not as isolated fragments, but as a unified nation-state. Railways and telegraph lines, unthinkable under the old system, now stitched the country together, their routes laid over maps that celebrated connection rather than fear. Yet the Kunizu's legacy lingers in modern Japan's ambivalence toward globalization, a reminder that borders drawn to protect can also strangle. The maps had kept Japan safe from colonization, but at what cost? When Perry's ships appeared on the horizon, they didn't just bring new technology, they held up a mirror to an empire that had spent centuries mapping its own cage. Today, fragments of Kunizu survive in museums, their faded pigments still whispering the shogun's edicts. They serve as a warning to all societies that would wall themselves off. A map that shows only what its makers dare to see isn't a guide, it's a requiem. While empires on continents fought bloody wars over lines in the dirt, the Polynesians were mastering an entirely different kind of map, one that charted not possession but motion. Their stick charts, deceptively simple lattices of palm ribs and shells, contained secrets that allowed navigators to cross thousands of miles of open Pacific without compass or sextant. Unlike European maps obsessed with fixed borders, these elegant constructs mapped the ocean's ever-shifting rhythms, the swell patterns that hinted at distant islands, the subtle changes in current that spoke of unseen atolls, even the flight paths of birds that led to fresh land. This wasn't cartography as domination, it was cartography as conversation, a dialogue between sailor and sea. The genius of these charts lay in what they omitted. No coastlines, no territorial claims, no markers of ownership, just webs of curved sticks showing how energy moved through water. A shell tide at an intersection might represent where two currents collided to form a productive fishing ground, while a series of downward curving ribs could trace the refraction pattern of waves bending around an unseen island. Each chart was intensely personal, often destroyed after a navigator's death, because their true power resided not in the object itself, but in the knowledge it represented. To read one required years of training, learning to feel the ocean's pulse through the soles of your feet on the canoe's hull and the tilt of the stars overhead. This approach produced something remarkable, an age of exploration without conquest. When Polynesians reached new islands from Hawaii to Rapa Nui to Aotearoa, they didn't arrive with maps claiming ownership. Their stick charts had taught them that the ocean wasn't something to be divided, but a living entity to be understood. Early European explorers were baffled to find that Polynesian chiefs couldn't produce maps of their territories, because the very concept made no sense in a worldview where boundaries shifted with the tides. A navigator from Tahiti might know 20 different paths to the Marquesas, but he'd laugh at the idea that any of those routes belonged to him. The stick chart's legacy whispers a provocative alternative to our modern obsession with borders. While medieval Europe was busy walling itself into feudal parcels, Polynesians were weaving a web of knowledge that connected rather than divided. Their maps didn't lead to wars over lines because they recognized the fundamental truth: the ocean, like the wind, refuses to be owned. Today, as satellites track every inch of our planet, we might pause to consider what those ancient navigators knew: that some things are too vast, too alive, to be captured on a map meant to claim rather than comprehend. The Zeno map was a masterpiece of deception, not because it lied, but because its creators believed their own fantasies. Crafted in the late 14th century by Venetian nobles Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, this enigmatic chart claimed to document a voyage to the North Atlantic, complete with detailed coastlines and exotic islands. Among its most tantalizing features was Friesland, a sprawling landmass southwest of Iceland that appeared on maps for over 2 centuries. The Zeno brothers swore they'd walked its shores, describing forests thick with game and harbors teeming with fish. There was just one problem: Friesland didn't exist. What began as an honest mistake, likely a mislabeled fragment of the Faroe Islands or Greenland, snowballed into one of cartography's most enduring myths. As the Zeno map circulated among European courts, Friesland took on a life of its own. English navigators plotted courses to its phantom ports, Spanish treasure fleets diverted to claim its imagined riches, and rival kingdoms nearly came to blows over rights to its fictional fjords. The island became so entrenched in maritime lore that when Martin Frobisher sailed into the Labrador Sea in 1576, he genuinely believed the icy cliffs he encountered were Friesland's southern coast. His discovery only deepened the illusion, leading to frantic revisions of world maps and fresh squabbles over territory that was, quite literally, water. The true cost of this cartographic ghost emerged when nations started waging real wars over imaginary lines. In 1589, Denmark and England nearly clashed over fishing rights near Friesland, with both sides citing the Zeno map as proof of prior claim. Only when a Dutch explorer, Willem Barents, meticulously charted the region in 1596 did the truth emerge. The island was a mirage, its outlines vanishing like fog under scrutiny. Yet even then, belief persisted. Some mapmakers, unwilling to admit error, simply moved Friesland farther north, where it lingered on charts as late as the 18th century. The Zeno map's legacy isn't just about a missing island, it's about the dangerous allure of certainty. In an age when explorers relied on sketchy accounts and half-remembered tales, maps offered the illusion of control. A line on parchment could conjure gold mines, spice routes, or entire continents into being, and once those lines were drawn, they became truths too costly to question. Modern satellite imagery has banished phantom islands from our atlases, but the instinct to trust lines over reality still haunts us. From disputed oil fields to airspace violations, we're still fighting over borders that exist more in our collective imagination than on the ground. The Zeno brothers never intended to spark conflicts, but their map proved a timeless lesson. When we confuse the world as it's drawn with the world as it is, the consequences can be very real and very bloody. Medieval monks hunched over parchment in dim scriptoria didn't just draw maps, they drafted divine blueprints for world domination. The TO map, with its deceptively simple design, was one of history's most insidious cartographic tricks. At first glance, it resembled a child's sketch. A circle, the O, divided by a T-shaped cross, with Asia occupying the top half, Europe and Africa sharing the bottom. But this wasn't geography, it was genealogy masquerading as science. The 3 continents were allocated to Noah's sons. Shem got Asia, the sacred center where Eden supposedly lay. Japheth received Europe and Ham was relegated to Africa, a detail that would echo catastrophically for centuries. With a few strokes of ink, these maps transformed biblical myth into territorial mandate, declaring the Earth's division not just natural, but ordained by God himself. What made TO maps so dangerous was their air of unquestionable authority. Unlike Portolan charts used by sailors, which bristled with practical details about coastlines and currents, TO maps floated above reality, their logic untethered from actual landscapes. Rivers might flow uphill, mountain ranges vanish, or entire regions distort to fit the theological framework. None of it mattered. The Hereford mapper Mundi, one of the most famous surviving examples, crammed the known world into a space smaller than its lavish illustrations of the Last Judgment. Jerusalem sat precisely at the center, not because of any surveyor's measurements, but because the Psalms declared it, the navel of the earth. These maps didn't guide travelers, they indoctrinated believers, teaching generations of Europeans that their supremacy wasn't just political, but cosmological. The consequences rippled far beyond monastery walls. When Pope Alexander VI drew his infamous line of demarcation in 1493, splitting the globe between Spain and Portugal, he wasn't just borrowing from TO geography, he was invoking its moral hierarchy. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, already labeled as descendants of Ham in some interpretations, became infidels occupying lands destined for Christian rulers. Columbus himself carried TO concepts westward, interpreting Caribbean islands as outlying fragments of Asia's divine domain. The maps had done their work so thoroughly that conquerors couldn't see the New World for what it was, only for what their cartographic catechism told them it should be. Yet the cruelest twist lay in the map's resilience. Long after actual explorers had disproven the TO model, Magellan's circumnavigation shattered the notion of a neatly tripartite world. The ideology embedded in those inked circles persisted. 19th-century missionaries still invoked the curse of Ham to justify slavery, while colonial powers dismissed African kingdoms as inherently chaotic, their borders illegitimate next to Europe's God-given nations. The TO map's true power wasn't in its accuracy, but in its ability to make prejudice look like piety and conquest like destiny. Today, these medieval documents gather dust in archives, their pigments faded but their poison still potent. They remind us that every border begins as an idea, and when that idea is wrapped in divine sanction, it can outlast empires, outlive evidence, and justify horrors its creators never imagined. The TO maps didn't just depict the world, they sought to create it in their own image, and for a terrifyingly long time they succeeded. In the hushed chambers of a Genos merchant's villa, a single act of cartographic theft set the world aflame. The Cantino planisphere, smuggled out of Lisbon in 1502, wasn't just a map, it was a detonator, exploding Portugal's carefully guarded monopoly on the spice trade. Commissioned by an Italian spy posing as a diplomat, this stunning parchment revealed what the Portuguese had killed to keep secret: the sea route to India, painstakingly charted by Vasco da Gama just 3 years earlier. Every coastline from Brazil to Malacca glimmered in vivid detail, but the real treasure lay in the crimson lines snaking across the Indian Ocean, trade winds and currents that could have a ship's journey time. Overnight, a document meant to crown Portugal as master of the East became a weapon in the hands of its rivals. The fallout was immediate and ferocious. Venice, facing economic ruin as Portuguese pepper flooded Europe, dispatched its own fleet using the stolen charts. The Ottomans, long middlemen in the spice trade, seized the map's data to fortify their Red Sea ports. Even the Mamluks of Egypt, who'd grown fat taxing overland caravans, suddenly found their leverage evaporating. But the true bombshell lay in the map's silent revelation, the New World. Cantino's depiction of Brazil's bulge, far east of the Treaty of Tordesillas line, gave Spain ammunition to challenge papal borders. What began as corporate espionage spiraled into a geopolitical free-for-all, with kingdoms realizing that control of the spice trade now hinged on who controlled the maps. Yet the Cantino planisphere's greatest impact wasn't on nations, it was on the very nature of knowledge itself. For centuries, maps had been guarded as state secrets, their power flowing from scarcity. But once this genie escaped its bottle, there was no forcing it back. Pirated copies spread through Antwerp's printing presses, their coastlines degrading with each reproduction like a game of cartographic telephone. By 1550, even provincial German merchants could buy crude versions, their margins crammed with apocryphal islands and phantom straits. The map hadn't just leaked routes, it had shattered the idea that geography could be owned. The spice race that followed was less about discovery than desperation. Portuguese captains, finding their advantage erased, pushed farther into uncharted waters, not to map but to obscure. They began falsifying their own charts, adding non-existent shoals to mislead competitors, while Spanish navigators did the opposite, deliberately erasing viable routes from captured maps. The Indian Ocean became a chessboard where every move was measured in ink and deception. When Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa in 1510, his first order wasn't to secure the treasury, it was to burn the city's map archives, ensuring no rival could replicate his strategies. Centuries later, the Cantino planisphere hangs in an Italian library, its once explosive lines now historical curiosities, but its legacy pulses through every modern trade war, every hacked database, every satellite image sold to the highest bidder. The lesson scribbled in its margins remains stark. In a world where knowledge is power, a map is never just a map, it's a spark waiting for tinder, and as long as borders can be drawn, they'll always be worth stealing. Martin Waldseemüller never set foot in the lands he named, yet his pen altered history more decisively than any conquistador's sword. In his workshop in the remote town of Saint-Dié, this German cartographer pored over accounts of Amerigo Vespucci's voyages, marveling at descriptions of a continent utterly unlike the Asia Columbus insisted he'd found. When Waldseemüller's massive world map unfurled in 1507, it bore a word that would echo through centuries: America, emblazoned across the southern half of the New World in elegant Latin script. This wasn't just labeling, it was an act of creation, transforming disparate coastlines into a coherent entity ripe for claiming. The map's accompanying pamphlet, Cosmologies Introductio, made the audacity explicit. Since Europa and Asia received names from women, I see no reason why we should not call this other part Amerige, the land of Amerigo or America. With that justification, a Florentine merchant's first name became a continent's identity. The political earthquake wasn't immediate, it was tectonic. Spain erupted in outrage when copies reached Seville. After all, Columbus had sailed for the Spanish crown, and here was some German scholar handing the glory to an Italian rival. Court geographers scrambled to produce maps reinstalling Columbana or Hispaniola Major over the offending label, but Waldseemüller's map had unleashed an idea too potent to suppress. By 1515, even Spanish charts begrudgingly adopted America, not because they accepted Vespucci's precedents, but because the name had already seeped into Europe's collective consciousness through pirated editions and woodcut copies. The cartographer himself had second thoughts, removing America from later maps, but the genie refused to return to the bottle. What's often overlooked is how this naming war mirrored deeper struggles over sovereignty. Indigenous nations from the Taino to the Aztecs had their own names for these lands: Guanahani, Anahuac, Tawantinsuyu, but Wald Simula's act erased those identities with a stroke of the press. The map didn't just describe territory, it scripted a narrative of discovery and ownership that European powers would perform for centuries. When English colonists referred to America, they weren't just using a convenient label. They were invoking a whole cosmology that positioned the continent as blank space awaiting European inscription. The cruelest irony, Vespucci likely never requested the honor. His letters, which inspired Wald Simula, were probably embellished by overzealous publishers. Yet this accidental namesake became the ghost lurking behind every border dispute, from the Treaty of Tordesillas to the Oregon Trail. Modern debates over who discovered America miss the point entirely. The real power lay not in stepping onto shores, but in controlling the maps that told the story afterward. Wald Simula proved that names aren't just words, they're the first draft of history, written by those who hold the pen. Today, as scholars rediscover indigenous toponyms and question colonial narratives, we're still wrestling with that 16th century German's choice, still learning that what we call a place shapes what we believe it's for. Imagine two kings hunched over a map, their quills hovering like swords as they prepared to carve up a continent neither had ever seen. In 1494, inside a Spanish town called Tordesillas, history's most audacious cartographic theft took place, not with weapons but with ink and papal authority. Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, drew a line down the Atlantic Ocean, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything east belonged to Portugal, everything west to Spain. With a single stroke, the New World was divided like a cake at a royal banquet, except the guests of honor. The millions of indigenous people living there weren't even acknowledged. This was the Treaty of Tordesillas, a document that proved borders could be conjured from thin air, and that the most destructive lines weren't drawn on battlefields, but in the quiet chambers of diplomacy. What made this line so insidious was its sheer arbitrariness. The Pope's division bore no relation to geography, tribal territories, or even basic logic. The chosen meridian sliced through the Amazon's uncharted vastness, through Andean civilizations, through lands already home to complex societies like the Taino and the Inca. But to Europe's power brokers, these weren't nations, they were empty spaces on parchment, waiting to be filled with crosses and castles. The treaty's language dripped with divine presumption. All lands discovered or to be discovered fell under this division, as if the earth itself had been waiting for Christian rulers to define it. The immediate consequences were catastrophic. Portuguese explorers, emboldened by their eastern claim, unleashed brutal slave raids along Brazil's coasts, while Spanish conquistadors used the treaty to justify massacres from the Caribbean to the Andes. When Cortés butchered his way through Mexico, he carried not just swords but copies of the papal bull legitimizing his violence. Indigenous leaders who protested were shown maps with the Tordesillas line, as if ink on vellum could erase millennia of occupation. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, presented with such a document, reportedly laughed until he realized the Europeans truly believed their lines overrode reality. Yet the treaty's true legacy lay in its precedent, the idea that land could be owned by those who'd never set foot on it. Later empires, the British in North America, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Belgians in Congo, would mimic this paper conquest, drawing borders that ignored ethnic, linguistic, and ecological realities. The scramble for Africa in the 19th century was just Tordesillas on a grander scale, with rulers thousands of miles away partitioning a continent over brandy and cigars. The cruelest irony, the line itself was a fantasy, Without accurate longitude measurements, no one could say precisely where the boundary lay. Spanish and Portuguese ships often discovered the same islands, each claiming they'd fallen on their side of the invisible divide. The Moluccas, rich with spices, became a particularly bloody bone of contention, with both nations insisting the islands were theirs. In the end, the treaty didn't prevent conflict, it guaranteed it, creating generations of disputes over borders that existed only in the minds of men who'd never seen the lands they claimed. Today, the Treaty of Tordesillas is a relic in a Portuguese archive, its wax seals cracked with age. But its ghost lingers in every modern border dispute, every resource war, every instance where lines on a map are mistaken for destiny. The Pope's line proved that cartography's greatest power isn't in reflecting the world, it's in inventing new ones, then forcing reality to conform. And as the indigenous peoples of the Americas learned too late, some lines aren't just drawn, they're inflicted. The Kangxi Atlas wasn't just a map, it was a masterpiece of imperial propaganda disguised as scientific progress. Commissioned by China's longest reigning emperor, this monumental work represented the most advanced cartography of its time, with teams of Jesuit astronomers and king surveyors taking precise astronomical readings across the empire. But behind its elegant grids and meticulous topography lay a darker truth. Every carefully measured mountain pass, every precisely charted river basin served to cement king domination over lands seized by force. The Atlas didn't record borders, it created them, transforming recent conquests into seemingly eternal facts of nature. Take the inclusion of Xinjiang, a region only recently conquered after decades of brutal campaigns against the Uighur Mongols. By depicting its deserts and oases with the same exacting detail as China's heartland, the Atlas performed a sleight of hand, erasing the bloody struggle that brought it under king control. What appeared as dispassionate geography was actually conquest by parchment, with survey teams following closely behind advancing armies like scribes documenting a fait accompli. Even the Atlas color scheme reinforced this narrative. Lands under direct king administration glowed in warm yellows and reds, while tributary states faded into cool blues, visually grading the empire's subjects like a spectrum of control. The Kangxi Atlas' true innovation wasn't its accuracy, but its air of inevitability. Previous Chinese dynasties had used maps to boast of their reach, but these were often symbolic. The all under heaven concept stretched on silk to flatter emperors' egos. The king went further, grounding their claims in Western mathematics. Jesuit advisors like Ferdinand Verbiest introduced triangulation techniques that gave the maps an aura of scientific objectivity. When Mongolian princes or Tibetan lamas questioned king authority, officials could point to these neutral measurements as proof the land belonged to China, as if borders derived from celestial observations carried more weight than those written in blood. This cartographic theater reached its peak with the Atlas treatment of Taiwan. After decades of resistance, the island had only been fully conquered in 1683. Yet the Kangxi Atlas depicted its mountain ranges and coastal settlements with the same authority as provinces held for centuries. The message was clear: Taiwan wasn't a contested frontier, but an integral part of the imperial body. Modern Chinese claims to the island still echo this 18th century cartographic gambit, proving how long a well-drawn border can outlive the empire that drew it. Yet for all its sophistication, the Atlas couldn't completely hide the violence beneath its veneer of order. Faint pencil marks in surviving copies reveal last-minute additions, new forts along the Amur River after clashes with Russia, adjusted borders following purges of rebellious minorities. These hurried corrections exposed the Atlas' central contradiction. It presented the king realm as a timeless natural order, when in reality it was a fragile construct, constantly reshaped by sword and fire. The Kangxi Atlas may have been science in service of empire, but like all maps, it told only the story its makers wanted preserved, one where conquest looked like destiny and empire like the very shape of the earth. The lines we fight over today were often drawn by rulers who crumbled to dust centuries ago. Take the modern Middle East, where borders sketched in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement didn't just ignore tribal territories, they resurrected ancient imperial divisions. The very concept of Iraq as a nation mirrors old Mesopotamian boundaries, while Israel and Palestine's contested lands still bear the ghostly outlines of Canaanite city-states. These aren't just political disputes, they're cartographic echoes, with modern generals unknowingly refighting battles first mapped on Babylonian clay tablets. Africa's colonial borders reveal an even starker truth: how easily ancient wounds can be reopened with a careless pen stroke. The Berlin Conference of 1884 didn't just partition a continent, it resurrected dormant rivalries from the Mali Empire and the Kingdom of Axum, forcing ethnic groups together or apart based on 19th-century greed rather than millennia of coexistence. The Tuareg rebellions in the Sahara, the bloodshed in the Great Lakes region, these aren't modern tragedies but eruptions of fault lines first drawn when Roman geographers labeled Africa's interior as terra incognita. Nowhere is this cartographic haunting more visible than in the South China Sea, where China's 9-dash line claim mirrors the Ming Dynasty's 15th century naval maps. Just like their ancestors, modern diplomats wave parchment to justify control over waters that have never belonged to any single power. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia each counters with maps of their own, some dating back to pre-colonial sultanates. It's as if Zhenghe's treasure fleet never left, still battling for dominance through proxies armed with satellite images instead of sails. Even Europe, with its carefully negotiated borders, can't escape this legacy. The war in Ukraine replays medieval conflicts between the Kievan Rus and the Golden Horde, while Balkan disputes over Kosovo and Republika Srpska trace back to maps drawn when the Byzantine and Ottoman empires collided. The irony, many of these borders were meant to be temporary. Sykes-Picot was a wartime stopgap. Africa's divisions were business arrangements, yet they hardened into immutable realities. Like cursed relics, these lines gained power simply because people kept believing in them. The lesson isn't that borders are meaningless, but that they're far more fragile than they appear. Every line on a map carries the weight of every hand that ever drew it: pharaohs, caliphs, colonizers, until we forget who drew them first. Modern technology hasn't changed this, it's just given us more precise tools to fight over the same imaginary lines. Drones and satellites now patrol frontiers first sketched by scribes using stars and guesswork. Perhaps the real question isn't where we draw borders, but whether we're brave enough to redraw them, or wise enough to leave some places unmapped entirely. From the first scratches on clay tablets to today's glowing screens, borders have never been neutral, they've been battle cries etched in ink and pixels. Think about that the next time your phone automatically reroutes you around a traffic jam. Even now, in an age of satellite precision, those digital lines pulsing on your navigation app carry the weight of centuries. The same instincts that drove Babylonian kings to exaggerate their realms on clay now shape how tech companies carve up digital territories, how nations dispute airspace and undersea cables, even how social media algorithms enforce invisible boundaries between ideologies. The tools have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. Consider how modern conflicts still unfold along fractures first mapped by long-dead empires. The drone strikes in disputed Kashmir, the oil rigs clashing in the South China Sea, the cyber attacks targeting national infrastructures. these aren't just 21st century skirmishes. They're the latest chapters in a story that began when the first ruler pressed a stylus into wet clay and declared, "This is mine." The Romans would recognize the tactics in Russia's hybrid warfare. The Venetians would nod approvingly at corporate espionage over 5G patents. History doesn't repeat, but cartography rhymes. Yet there's hope in this pattern. If borders are imagined, they can be reimagined. Look at the indigenous communities from Canada to Australia using GPS technology to reclaim ancestral lands, literally redrawing maps to reflect suppressed histories. Or the open-source mappers charting refugee routes and disaster zones, proving that cartography can be an act of solidarity rather than domination. Even the chaos of cryptocurrency, with its decentralized ledgers and virtual borders, echoes the Polynesian stick charts, offering an alternative to rigid territorial thinking. The most powerful lesson from these ancient map wars: control the story and you control the soil. The Aztecs learned this when their sacred geography was reduced to real estate deeds. The Incas' Quipus unraveled when met with Spanish deeds and titles. Today, as billionaires auction plots on Mars and nations race to claim lunar mining rights, we're witnessing the same old drama on a cosmic stage. The parchment has become code, the quills are now algorithms, but the question remains, who gets to draw the lines? So as you swipe through your weather app or glance at a subway map tomorrow, pause for just a second. Those lines under your fingertips, they're alive with ghosts of kings who drew too boldly, of sailors who crossed anyway, of rebels who burned the maps and dared to navigate by stars. The past isn't finished, it's just waiting for the next hand to pick up the pen. If this deep dive into the wars waged with compasses and clay left you seeing maps in a new light, hit that like button, drop a comment about which ancient cartographic clash shocked you most, and subscribe for more journeys into history's hidden battlegrounds. After all, the next border war might be raging on a screen right in front of you, and now you'll know how to read